So hello, folks that are joining us online, watching the recording, the folks that have joined us down at the downtown campus. You guys know me, I'm Bree Jackson, the director of CETL, and just want to introduce our really exciting discussion that we have that's really kind of a follow-up to the Equity Reading Club, and it's going to be on ungrading. So our guest is from VCU, Mike Porter from VCU. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about ungrading, what he does in his position, and kind of just tie it all together as we wrap up the reading of this book. So thanks for coming.
All right, thank you. Real excited to talk about this. It's something that, is a relatively, not new topic, but a topic that's gaining a lot of steam. It's something that I've been working with a lot of faculty recently as well. I guess just quickly, how many of you were part of that reading group? Okay. So have you finished the book that you were working on?
I haven't, have you?
We're in the last third of it.
I know, you don't ask students if they finish. They're like, yeah, we get there.
Well, we've
But-
read a good chunk of it.
You got the key parts out. And I'm not familiar with the book, but familiar with a lot of the research that's drawn upon. So I think it's all in the same pool that people are talking about. Just a quick kind of background myself. My role is similar to Bree's, is in faculty development, instructional curricular support. So how I've kind of gotten into this was really just working with a lot of faculty through various challenges that they've had. And we've just kind of come across the same sort of issues in terms of how do you keep students engaged and how do you get them focused on what you want to achieve, which is often learning, and versus sort of performative and measurable components of grades and other components. It just kind of felt weird. We moved in this particular direction. So, this is real unstructured today. I'll talk a little bit about just the journey that I've taken with our faculty in terms of getting this off the ground and where it's gone. But really, this is your time, your questions, things that we can discuss. I'm great with interruptions. For those of you who are on Zoom, you might just need to either unmute or throw it in the chat. I'm bad with the chat, but I will respond. So let me know and we can just go from there. It's real informal. But I did want to start with a question since you showed up here. What's your impetus? What about this topic sort of sparked your interest? What was your call to action to learn more about this?
So for me, I would say that it is a combination of grading is tedious. Students focus on the number and not the content. And the goal is really this piece of, I want students to be focused on their growth and how they're learning and how they're engaging with the content rather than why did I get 1 point off here? Why did I get 1 point off here? How many points do I need to get a whatever grade?
Yeah, hard to argue that. You started the book club. What was kind of your interest?
It was personal for me. I was doing a faculty development workshop here at Reynolds. And it was a big, big one. It's like you get 10 hours of professional development and it's over 6 weeks and whatever. And I got 30 out of 100 on one of the discussion boards. And then I had to totally reframe my attitude about it's the learning. It's not the grade. I didn't comment on that. But it was I still got the learning. And then I thought, wow, wouldn't that be wonderful if that's how everybody thought? We're here to learn. Maybe we can talk CJ into ungrading so I don't get any more bad grades.
But no, we're so accustomed to it.
Exactly.
And it does. You're anchored to that. And
the question I sent to you in the email was, how do you convince students of that?
Yeah.
Because they've come through the whole system looking at their grades and they're worried about their GPA and so they can get into college and do whatever. And then all of a sudden we're going to say, no grades.
And there is that dynamic because, we're not turning over a system in a day. You operate within this system, within these constructs, you know this. But at the same time, what can be done to focus less on it? I think one of the things that stood out to me when I was doing some earlier research on this was, some work on how students define themselves by that letter. I'm an A student, I'm a B student, I'm a C student. And you start to think about that. You walk into a room, well, I'm a C student. Well, I have expectations of what that means, and they're capping themselves. And you know, that's really terrifying to think about.
I'd like to build on that too, because as a science professor, a lot of times I'll hear, I can't do math, I can't do science. So like, they come in with that mentality of, even just in this one section, I'm not good enough.
Yeah,
Right? And it's like, it's that whole, no, we need to blow that away.
and we think they're comparing themselves to their peers, they're comparing themselves to a number.
Right.
You know, it almost would be okay if you're like, okay, well, these 5 people, I'm the weakest at this, at least like, it's concrete. But we've got this number system, which we know is kind of flawed and arbitrary, you know, and so that really was the wake-up call for me, in a sense that you can't be defining students by these particular letters or numbers, what they might be. You know, when I started working with some of the faculty, and this originated in our gerontology department, and we've since done with a few other departments, we had a conversation with an instructor, and it started with this question of, my students don't look at the feedback I provide. And they're like, I'm putting all this work into the feedback and they don't look at it. And so we just started working backwards from that. Like, why do they not look at it? And they're like, well, you know, if they get the grade, they don't look at it. If they get a low grade, they don't. We joke, we should just all give them 50s and then have them read the feedback and then change the grade afterwards. And it just kind of went through, like, well, if this isn't working what you want them to do, then if the grade's getting in the way of looking at the feedback, what if we take it away? And it started at that kind of somewhat radical question at the time, like, what if we just don't do this? And we kind of went from there. You know, what I wanted to ask you all, because this is something that I came across with each individual worked with here, is why do you grade?
Because we're told we have to.
Yes,
Because we have
it's always the
to do
answer.
something
There's-
in
there-
SIS.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
one answer, it's always because we have to. What's interesting about that is part of it's true and part of it's not true. We do have to submit grades, you know. But how we grade, so like, I haven't really come across anyone who's, when they got hired, are like, here's exactly how you have to grade, here's the mechanics of it, here's why we score these points, here's why we score these letters. Typically in higher ed, there's a lot of autonomy as to what this works with. So you kind of base it off of what you know or what your peers do or what you remember from being a student, and then you put it in end result. So we grade because that's what we know, as well as we have to submit something at the end.
So another interesting point about this is I think that, again, showing my age, I come from the time where you had like 3 exams, right? Or like 3 papers,
Mhm.
if that, in a class. And then as I've gone through my higher education journey as an instructor, it's this piece of, no, we need to have more of the formative assessments available for students. We have to have more scaffolding on assignments. We have to create the rubrics. We have to have all these extra pieces that creates that tedium of grading, right? And I feel like with this ungrading, we're kind of coming back full circle where we're gonna pull back again. So I think this is interesting that, and maybe this is just my life cycle as an academic, that I've come full circle.
No, and you're absolutely right, because I also remember that time of, you know, you had a midterm, you had a final, you maybe had another project. Those were the graded ones, but you were always doing work. You were doing, it wasn't as if you just coasted the rest of the time. You were doing work. Now, unfortunately, there was a lot of high stakes on those particular items, and they're, you know, that's problematic as well, but you're right. We've moved so much towards, well, we've kind of gotten off the path with formative assessments, meaning they're supposed to be formative, they're not supposed to be graded.
Right.
Right.
But, you know, we got in the world of measuring everything, and this is a great way to have this, and so then it became this, you know, pile of grading. So, you know, it's something we want to ask yourself, and this is something that we asked the other instructors, you know, after we got to ask this question of feedback was, what do we want students to learn? And then are grades helping them achieve that goal? And sometimes the answer is yes, they are. You know, there is no one path, and some classes are different and constructed. In the particular courses we started with here, like I said, it was a gerontology program, and it was really about creating a culture of care and an understanding of elderhood and working against ageism and supporting people. These are not things that fit themselves well to multiple choice tests. And when we looked at their professional standards and what they're looking for in their actual careers, none of that aligned to like, well, you scored really well on this true false test, or you did this over here. Like that's not what is measured for success. So we said, well, the grades don't actually help at all. And they don't measure who's gonna be good out in that field, who's gonna be successful out in that field. So what they needed them to learn was really far away from what they were having them assessed for. And that misalignment was really just causing stress on everyone's end. The instructors were not happy with how things were turning out. The students were not happy being graded that way, and it wasn't helping them in their careers. So, we started with this idea of like, okay, well, let's just talk about what we want them to learn. And then start to talk about from that, how would you see it? And sort of like stepping back as an instructor in this case, say like, as a professional, as someone who's worked in the field, most of our instructors had field experience. Like, how do you know that someone's good at it? We're just writing this down. So we had a whiteboard, just like, what do you know? How do you just, we all know. You sit in a room with someone, they've got it. Write it down. And I said, okay, well, how would we be able to assess a student on that? And that's the conversation we wanted to have. We're like, forget about how we're going to grade them at the end. And I will say, we had to have that sort of intervention about 1,000 times. Just put the grades aside, put them back aside. Even though we kind of committed to doing ungrading, there was so much, but we have to submit a grade at the end. I said, we'll get there. I didn't really know how, but I just said we will get there. And so we just started kind of working backwards saying, okay, what we found in the initial sort of pilot was our first person was, they wanted to be able to hear from the student that not only could they apply what they've learned in class, but they were able to think through things ethically, and they were able to grow from these particular scenarios. So they wanted things to be rewritten and reflected upon. And so they want to be able to have a conversation with them and know that they're thinking both about the individual they're caring for and the broader system. So we were like, okay, well, what does that mean, and how would that best be demonstrated? And that really came through, well, we want them to write something, and then we want them to talk about the process either with their peers, with the instructor, what that might be. And none of this really fit well with grades. So we said, okay, well, let's consider that as a starting point, and how many of those sort of iterative cycles are going to be around it. And so that was one of the starting points. I want to step aside from that. We'll get back to the story for a second. Because at that point, and we had a few classes going with it, something that came about that I think that, if you start to go down this pathway, you want to recognize is that you're going to be going down two concurrent journeys. There's the journey of yourself, kind of you navigating, breaking away from how you traditionally taught and evaluated and assessed and had confidence in what you're doing. And then there's the student journey of never having done this before and not being assessed and operating without a net and having, what has previously been a measure of their self-worth in many ways. And those are direct words we received from multiple students. We started to collect information qualitatively on this through some surveys, and sadly, that's what we heard multiple times. This was my worth. I felt great when I got an A, I felt terrible when I didn't. So one of the things that I would really emphasize is that talking about this once, introducing it in your class is not going to be enough. The students are going down a radical journey that they've never been through. And it's going to stress them out. And we felt this in the 4 classes that we initiated this with. It's like it started off the first day, you introduced it, ungrades, great. About 3 weeks in, the panic set in. How do I know if I'm doing well? I need to pass this class. I need to do this. And there was this, this intense kind of concern and stress. And that's, you try to build trust. You say, well, we're going to get you through it. But you have to expect that because, we are all kind of grounded in how this works. And, as people in academia, we've been on both sides of the table so long, you know how class works. You know how to get grades. You know how to go through the system. And now the system's gone. It's really stressful on students. So one thing you really want to emphasize is how can you help support students through this new journey? so that they can kind of stick with it and see the end result, because it takes a bit. And the same thing is on your end. It was stressful on our instructors who did this. We actually had them do some reflective journaling. So every week they kind of wrote down emotions about like how this is going. And we recently presented that information at a conference. And it's a roller coaster. There was times where they're like, I screwed up. What am I doing? I am failing my students by not doing this. This is, selfish of me to go this route. Other times they're like, they had some wins and they had, situations where the students shared like their understanding of concepts deeper than they ever had. I said, okay, this is great. I feel like I'm making my progress. But and I say that because it's new for you as well, and it's not something that is going to be natural to kind of go through because you're going to want to see, like, when you walk away from the structure, there's the what ifs, and I figured we'd bring that up. What are your concerns? What are the scenarios that you're most concerned about happening that maybe gets us off the rails?
I don't know, if students are in a course, my students are education students, but they're just so sweet and they want to be teachers, they're great students. They probably have a fit if there was Ungrading. But I do ask questions like, what's something that we talked about that you shared with a friend or with your partner? Or what's something that you think you're never gonna forget, stuff like that. And they get points for it, but I'm hoping that helps them to reflect on their own learning. So how do we get them to reflect on their own learning? I guess my question is really, what if they just don't do it because there's no grade attached?
Yeah.
So that's the question. It's come up in all our classes. It's happened in all the classes.
Or, I doubt my students, that's where my brain started. I doubt that my students would do that, but if I was in a geography class, I might do it because I don't really care.
So this happened. This happened every time. And we'll say it's not across the board. In particular, it happened with discussion posts. These classes had discussions, they were regular, sort of the traditional structure, post, reply, that kind of thing. And they kept that going. And introduced ungrading, and by about week 3, discussions just fell off.
Right. Because they're boring.
And that was when we sat down. So they called me back in, sat down with the instructors on this, and I said, all right, well, we have a great opportunity here. What your students are actually telling you, and being honest with you right now, is they don't like doing this because they don't find it effective. They used to do it because it was just performative and it was just for points. They never liked it then, and they never learned anything then. Now they're actually giving you honest feedback. So what are you going to do with that honest feedback? And it went twofold. Sometimes it was, in some way, okay, we can reshape this. We're going to change how the frequency of these discussions, or the frequency of those assignments. And then it was also, because you don't have grades, you can kind of get really direct with students and say, hey, you know that we're assessing you on your whole output and your effort here. You can't fall back on, I just did all the compliance work, because compliance doesn't matter anymore. This isn't good enough, and we're not having these dialogues. How would you like to have these dialogues? And that's exactly what they brought to the students. It's like, and in some cases, they had to have individual consultations with certain students, saying, I'm just not seeing you put in what I think is required to kind of succeed in this course. There are going to be some students who fall off, but those are the same students that may have fallen off before. Like, we have to acknowledge that fact. Before, we kind of had that easy, well, the number says that I can go. So I did. Much, much harder when you don't have that number to say, I'm not going to bring them there, but you have an opportunity to have more dialogue. Does that kind of get at it a bit? But there is going to be, they basically vote with their effort. Now, we really didn't have any issues with any of the larger projects. More substantial projects in the course, even though they didn't have grading, students kind of recognize, like, this is a key component. And when they get to the end and we're discussing grades, because those grades were a conversation, they kind of knew, well, I'm not going to get the grade I need. I'm not going to pass this class if I didn't do the major work.
That is.
Yeah.
No, and this is the thing that drives it. So, I've taught Spanish for 24 years. That's primarily what I do is teach Spanish. And this is how I taught my literature courses. It was very holistic. We had themes, we had projects. But I like teaching grammar. I love 101, 111, whatever they call it at different institutions. The hardest part I've always run into is that the other instructors are obsessed. And I say obsessed because they believe they have not learned Spanish unless they have done every vocabulary quiz and every grammar quiz and every this, and it must be worth this, and if the students don't do it, they can't move on. What they don't realize is they are causing the students to not speak the language. And when you take all that out and you give them practice, they will actually try to speak the language. But when they're doing 35 multiple choice assignments on a textbook that's plugged into Canvas, because it's their grade, they've learned absolutely nothing. So every time I try to broach the subject, well, let's take this out, let's cut these back, let's just have these, let's just do the recordings where the instructor gives the audio back if it's not a face-to-face course. They just flip out. It's not the rubric, it's not the grammar, it's not that. They're not learning the language. And I have yet to find an effective way to convince them, but it is, because even these folks aren't even all native speakers. They're folks like me. I didn't learn Spanish in school. I learned Spanish from my family. So, and I'm not a native speaker, but they don't realize that that's the same way our students can learn. They think they can only learn by the kill and drill. That's what we call it in language, is kill and drill. And I'm teaching again next semester, and I know what's going to happen. I'm going to start deleting assignments because I'd rather have a conversation, and they're going to.
And then deleting assignments, going to speak to the discussions, that's kind of what we did.
Yeah.
Because we ended up, the frequency, the number of formative pieces decreased that were sort of required, and it was like more, but the accountability on what was left went up. The accountability on readings went up. Because, as we had a class, like, we're going to talk about this reading assignment. We're going to talk about the books. We're going to dig into this. And it took about a half a semester for them to get even warmed up to that idea. And to the point the instructors were really concerned. And then, but it came through. Oh, they're finally turning around and we're having deeper conversations than we ever were actually reading the book. Because they had to keep convincing the students, I swear, we're not grading. This is what we want to do. I want you to talk. And we're going to sit here and stare in silence until we converse about this. Because they were like, we need to have this conversation. But that took time. It's not something that people just jumped into.
I was gonna ask Donna almost exactly what you said. She teaches composition.
Okay.
So if you gave feedback but no grade, would your students read your feedback and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite?
Well, they have an end point. They want to get a grade. And that's what I worry about, is they rarely rewrite now, even though they'll get a better grade if they rewrite something better. And so I'm not sure how much they pay attention to what I say, because they're not doing there are rules for writing, you just have to the semicolon, the rules of it. But I'm not sure, honestly, that they would do that. And this is, I'm not that old, but I remember talking about this 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So ungrading, so I was like, oh, is this gonna change from the 20-year thought? And so are you still going to what they used to talk about, the ungrading, or do you even know?
What do you mean exactly? I know, yes, it's come across over time.
Has this progressed, or are we going back to what the thought was 20 years ago? Because the problems we're having with the SOLs is perfect for this.
Yeah.
It's not grading you on anything, you're
Yep.
teaching to the test.
Absolutely.
And that's what happens. And so I am teaching you to the test. This is the way you're gonna use a semicolon. But I need you to be able to write because you're communicating online. If we don't understand it, it doesn't mean anything. And it is a AI right. And so if you send something from AI to Grammarly, it actually finds things wrong. So the AI can find something wrong in the AI. So, and a tutor, a brain-fused tutor can find things wrong. The question is the standardization. You should know these things. You're coming out of college. It's not high school anymore. And so that's the question is, are they even paying that much attention? And with the only power that we have is that grade.
Well, I'm wondering if they're
In
not
some
paying
ways.
that much attention because, and I say this now as a mom of 2 college students who are so open with me. My kids are not using ChatGPT and AI except for when, as my son says, I take those stupid business classes. But they actually want to learn because they're into their subject. My son will get not a great grade on one of his papers. He's studying physical therapy. And he'll call me, he's all upset. And I'm like, but doesn't your instructor have a, resubmit policy with the feedback? And he's like, I don't have time. because I
Yeah.
turned that in and I've gotten the feedback, but now I have 10 more assignments.
Right.
And he's like, I would love to do that, but I'm the
And-
coach of this and that's how I have my
Right,
first
it's not even
scholarship.
10
It's
more assignments for
awful.
that one class, it's you
It's-
have a lot of,
Right.
am I gonna, and I always say to my students, just because you turn something in, it doesn't mean it's gonna get a better grade. Because if you haven't done anything,
Yeah.
or what you did was not what you're supposed to have done, that sometimes you can go down and talk about making somebody work. Then, because sometimes you change things and it gets worse. You know, so.
And yeah, I think two things that I want to mention that might relate to that came up. One was this idea of deadlines. Like, there was some pushback on students like, well, they wouldn't turn things in. I'm like, well, I don't need to turn it in. It's not graded. When do I need, I can't do it today. I can't do it tomorrow.
Right.
And there is a lot of flexibility sort of baked into this to allow for like, okay, I have other work, I have other assignments. But in one particular case, the instructor really sat down and said, why do you think we had deadlines? What do we talk about with these? And they turned it into this discussion about their profession and kind of delivering things when expected. And then being open about like when you need an extension and just saying, hey, I need some work on this. So that kind of helped to degree with the amount of work. We had many students, more than expected, kind of reach out with, personal issues and crises and different things saying like, this is impacting what I'm working on right now, or I need this there. So like, there was a little bit more open dialogue there, and it became a challenge in sense, but there was a way of okay, well, what's our alternative? How do we shape this in a way that we can still, get the work done?
Well, with me, I mean, English 111 is everybody. And so I'm not in a profession or anything like that.
Sure.
So I'm just teaching you how to write to the world. And I don't actually penalize students for late. It's English. I'm fine wine. I know you are. I gotta sit on a shelf sometimes and let it ferment in my brain. And I know myself, I do everything at the last minute. You told me to do it at 11:59, it's gonna be done at 11:58, because that's the way I think. And I know it's not a real world thing. I have a job. I understand you have deadlines in the real world, but I don't necessarily think it would be fair grading you on a deadline. I'm grading you on your writing capabilities. And so that's what I don't penalize people for late. And then they flip out, oh my God, no, I don't care if it's late. I want you to just do it. And it makes my life a little difficult the semester because I'm grading a lot. But even the problem at that point is you give them a lot of feedback. I always give them feedback. But towards the further you get along in the semester, the less chance they're gonna have feedback. But they're in my 111 and then they come to my 112 and then they're in my English classes. And so I can see the progress. You're still having that exact same problem you had in 111 and you still had 112 and you're not reading, I'm giving you the exact same feedback. I'm gonna give you that paper with the same, because I saved that thing. And that helps because it's feedback. It's like, no, this is the same issue we were doing before. So the grading thing sometimes is going, if you're doing this habit all the time and you're not changing, how am I gonna stop it without penalizing you with a grade? Because I'm not gonna do anything for late. And so this has always been the situation. How am I gonna tell them this is important, that they know how to write?
Yeah, it's a challenge of writing.
Yeah.
And Jose, I'll get to your question in 1 second here.
Mhm.
One thing I wanted to bring up, because as soon as you mentioned composition, so the book I most recently read and brought with me was this Undoing the Grade.
Mhm.
Series of essays, really great. The conversation was brought up because the author is English composition.
Yeah.
He's and one thing he brought up that I thought was a really great technique in terms of feedback, because they're like, well, how do I possibly give all this feedback on all these papers over and over again? We don't want to create more work for instructors. Which I thought was great was that when the students submit their work, each time, in addition to submitting their work, they indicate what areas they want feedback on.
Yeah.
What areas of the paper, what areas there, and they only read and reviewed those pieces. Like, I just would go to the sections.
BrainFuse does that too. These are the 5 areas, 3 areas I want to do. It's the introduction and conclusion. Is it the thing? And that's what BrainFuse does. But the problem is sometimes they're missing the bigger problem, and so is somebody gonna tell them something? So I've seen that, and that's 20 years ago was thought, well, I'm gonna grade you on the thing you want me to grade you on most. But what happens if the problem is bigger and you're not addressing it? So how much, do you just forget it? Do you not consider it in the grade? And that's like, because you're gonna have to give me something to put in SIS, so I'm gonna have to have
And
something.
I imagine you have a challenge with probably large class sizes.
Yeah.
So it's individual consultations, while really helpful, probably are less realistic.
Yeah.
And so that does create that next layer of challenge of like, well, how do I sit down with them and talk about those bigger issues?
Yeah, Neil deGrasse Tyson was on Stephen Colbert, and he's like, I'm sorry, I'm really tired of these liberal arts people complaining about AI. We need AI. It's good for science. I'm not saying it isn't. Have a conversation with your students. Instead of having a paper, have an oral test. And you're going, but we have 25 students.
There's some scalability.
How are you gonna do that? And so I understand, I totally am for it, especially in the literature class, because you can have that.
Yeah.
But if it's a writing class and then putting the punctuation, what does the works cited look like and that kind of thing.
Oh, Lord, I mean, Spanish 101, like, because I try to have those conversations with them when they make the appointment, and oh, Lord, those weeks.
Yeah.
Because I teach in the evenings, obviously,
Yeah.
and it is just packed, one student after another for a conversation, yeah.
Want to get to Jose's question? Oh, you have his
Oh,
hand up. You go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I've experimented with ungrading before, and even right now I'm doing contract grading, and I'm just not satisfied with either. I'm not satisfied with contract grading for lots of reasons, right? Because you grade on effort and labor put in, but then that's not fair to people who have to put in more labor for the same amount of work. So I was never satisfied. And with the ungrading, what I did was have them self-assess. So it's just like, well, what grade do you think? Here's a rubric. What grade do you think you should get? And justify it to me. But then I would have reflections where I made them pick out stuff from my feedback to say, why did you or did not use this feedback when you revised? Because they have to turn in a rough draft and then a final draft. But in all that, the biggest kind of thing that always gets in my way is the logistics of, at the end, we have to give them a grade. And so kind of figuring that out, trying to let them know this is what you have to do to get a grade at the end, even if you're not being graded like this. I teach composition and literature, right? So, trying to get them to think of like, okay, you're not going to get graded on this paper. I'm going to give you feedback. You're going to revise it. You're going to grade yourself. But then like having to like use Canvas and like put a grade in, and like that's the logistics of it always left me doing a lot more work than I wanted to do.
And I think that the logistics part, like you said, the kind of mechanics we got to work through can be a real limiting factor. I mean, I think we can't deny where we stand with that. With the courses that we kind of moved along, it didn't all go as planned. In fact, one course ended up sort of stepping back into a more graded structure for the rest of the semester because it wasn't best serving the students at that point. They kind of rushed in. They were the last ones to jump in. They were like, they literally heard us down the hall. We're like, hey, can we do that? Probably not the best plan. Yeah.
So, speaking of students, did you see that like your younger right out of high school students bought in, or the older students who had come back?
So our students were primarily juniors and up.
Okay.
So we don't have any freshmen, sophomores for the program.
Oh, yeah.
So it certainly it's different coming straight out of high school. I can't speak to that directly. But in terms of who, there was no really connection between age that we observed. Some of our students in the master's program, some older students did well, some struggled. It was more of an individual student, situation. I think it had more, at least from what I've observed and read through some of the comments, had more to do to that kind of how well that student defined themselves by grades. The students were like, that's how I do this. They struggled hard.
Well, the question I have though is if they're juniors, they have 2 years of experience. Actually, maybe they're more rigorous and do things as opposed to the ones that are coming right out of high school who aren't doing anything anyway. But I mean, I don't know, how could you judge a junior in college to a freshman? Is my question too.
Like what do you mean by comparing?
No, just a freshman in whatever age,
Sure,
somebody
yeah.
who doesn't have the rigor and the experience of doing this for over the year, even if they were junior, like, and they left.
Well, I think the
year off.
conversation is more, I mean, there is the maturity and the ability to sort of handle this process. But in terms of like evaluating in the course, you have sort of your course aims and outcomes, and they're obviously different. And so the freshman courses have this lower standard of expectation or more preliminary expectation versus those junior, senior level courses. So I think you do eventually evaluate them to a higher standard there. That actually could potentially be really more beneficial, because we think about when students often struggle the most is when they first get in and all of a sudden it's high stakes, it's not what they expected the rigor to be, but they haven't been trained on sort of how to think about their own work. We can't change what's happening in high schools right now. But we can have this conversation now, and maybe hopefully by the time they move through college, they're better and more open to the dialogue.
Did you guys find you had to change the learning objectives at all, or were you able to work with what was originally there?
We are change them for the second year.
Okay.
Yeah, and so these courses are in their second year. Some of them are about to start their third semester of this. And yes, some of those objectives were modified a bit. I will say assignments were modified radically the second year. Somewhat based on, like I said, the discussions didn't work, or this,
Right.
we didn't get the, some of those things where they turned in, they weren't doing the feedback, or they weren't implementing it. So, well, what can we do with the instruction to maybe change this so they would, embrace that more?
Were you able to go higher in Bloom's taxonomy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was one of the easiest things to do, really, because we didn't longer have to say recall, and then, those are gone.
Did you use much peer review? I mean, in writing classes, 111, 112, we're always using peer review. Did you do anything where the students were working to help each other?
That is something we have not done.
Because that's feedback.
Yes, and that's something that I've been kind of hoping that we do more of. It's part of the nature of these courses. Some of these courses are high flex, and that's made peer review a little bit challenging with them not being limited to the same individuals, or they're completely asynchronous, and then there was a different kind of challenge. So I haven't got the instructors to kind of take that leap, but I do see the value in peer review as being a component of this, because we want to train people to be able to look at each other's work critically, give feedback, but not give, you think about this when you do peer review that's graded. Students know, why would I give my peer a poor grade? Because they're gonna, it's come right back at me. And so you have that, we've actually oftentimes already taken that away, just give feedback. But haven't had any direct experience with that.
I have one of the first, real quick, one of the first assignments I do in 111, 112 with my students is they actually read an essay that was written somewhere along the way in an English textbook, blah, blah, blah. And I have the strengths and weaknesses, most necessary part for revision, what would you grade it and why? And I'm not saying that you're gonna tell their student, but it's amazing how you get an essay that's not really good, that you probably wouldn't be given more of a C, and then it's plagiarized, but they don't know it's plagiarized. And the variety, and you give them your rubric, and all of a sudden it's, oh, I love the topic, and they're not grading them on anything that's in the writing, it's how much I agree with it, and the passion, and sometimes you can fall apart. But I think that sometimes the students don't realize what it is involved in even giving a review, and our grade is not graded if I like the topic, it's if it's written well.
Your spark something I think it was what Jose was mentioning earlier, I wanted to bring up was when we ask students to self-assess or to do a rubric, have we ever trained them on how to self-assess or how to read a rubric?
And they're not getting it from high school.
So, no, I mean,
Well, the individual instructor
how
has
would
to
you
do
how
that,
would you know that? I mean, there is some skill and training into being able to actually evaluate that. And so we wonder why the results aren't great. So, well, yeah, they can check the boxes, but they really just know what that means. So, and it's hard because you're like, well, I don't have time in my class to teach students how to do that. And frankly, there's not really a good answer to that. I'd say why is my class going to be the sort of martyr here and take this down and teach this process? But then we keep pushing it along.
And we keep giving them rubrics and they don't know what to
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing with the rubric. If you think about that, when we get back to performance, what do students do in a rubric? They look to the right, whatever the highest number. Like, oh, I need to be here. But you don't need to be there, right? Sometimes that's if we say we have satisfactories in the middle, and then we have outstanding. It's okay to be satisfactory, but how do we convince people that that's actually where you want to be? That yes, some things can be outstanding, but that's all right. But that's not how we've set up our scoring. 100, full points is outstanding. We're gonna need to have a conversation about that. One thing I wanted to bring up before, I know we have a little bit of time left here, is how this kind of plays out early on. And this is something that we learned, that we've changed a bit with our classes, is we introduced it initially said, introduced this in the first day of class, it's in the syllabus. And this was the first semester doing this, introduced it. And students were like, yeah, that's great, positivity. And they didn't think anything of it until the first assignment was due. And then they were like, what does this mean? What are we doing with this? You didn't tell me about this. Where's our grades? We realized that we needed to communicate a lot more. And one of the approaches that one of the instructors has taken that I love is that she introduces this day one very briefly and tells them, don't even worry about this right now. We are coming back to this in 2 weeks. Just want to let you know this is how I'm going to approach this course. We're going to get there when we're ready for it. And then 2 weeks in, then she kind of does a deeper dive into what this actually means in terms of ungrading, what this means in terms of how your first assignment is going to be assessed. Doesn't do it on day one. Lets the kind of class get used to each other, and that approach the second semester had a lot more a positive impact, because it just again, it wasn't all thrown at them on day one. It's some radical approach, and what am I doing with this? But the communication has to be kept up over and over again. Okay,
I'm waiting.
Yep, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just have broader comments for the end.
Yeah.
Are we there?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're there now.
Okay, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that I feel like this method of evaluation kind of gets back to what we value, right? And so the students very clearly pointed out what they value in terms of the type of assignments they want to spend their time doing. We can be more descriptive and clear about what we value them learning, the learning, not the grade. But then I think it also speaks to that broader perspective of why you come to college in the first place, right? And what you're valuing is this content awareness and gaining of the knowledge rather than, the grades, right?
Are you paying for the knowledge or are you paying for the grade?
Exactly. And I think too much of our society has a view of higher ed as this is the piece of paper I need to get to somewhere else. And it's not the knowledge, right? And I think that's part of this shift that appeals to me about ungrading.
Yeah, and I think it's hard because there's some fields that in majors that lend themselves more to sort of that esoteric kind of thinking, and we just want to learn. Other ones are very much, I need that piece of paper, I need that, I need to pass a licensure exam.
Right.
And that's one of those structures that's in place. So how do we kind of work within that? I mentioned it, this is taken off with our gerontology department. For our programs that have these licensure exams, physical therapy and such, they're a little bit more cold about this. They're just simply saying like, no, they needed to be able to know all the parts of the body, multiple choice, to be able to answer these.
There's some comments in the chat.
Oh, yeah.
I like that rubric, 0 points or 1. You did it and you didn't.
Yeah,
It's complete or incomplete.
very similar 1-point rubric.
It's the low stakes
Mm.
assignments.
Or if it was a check instead of a point, if that would
Yeah,
do them.
There's the check on check sort of thing, yep.
Yeah.
And that's something that I would wanna kind of, mention is ungrading doesn't necessarily mean 100% ungrading. In fact, the instructors that have gone through this, they've all now settled at a different spot. Some are mostly ungrading. Some are ungrading except for the summatives, and all the formative work is ungraded. Some are using some more like reducing the value on points. We talked about contract grading. We had some fits and starts with that, but you can do that. You can do specifications grading. You can really just anything you can do to reduce the emphasis on the grades themselves is really where people have landed. And I think that makes sense because each course in the curriculum, your outcomes are a bit different as well. There are things that may need to be graded. You know, we can go back to some of those those programs that do have certification exams or there's a right or wrong answer. Why not have, you know, still take those questions? You can have a multiple choice test that has no grade at the end. Each question's still right or wrong, but you're not giving the grade for what they did. Because there are questions that have, you know, one answer. You still have those. So that we're not taking away those concepts. You know, you just might want to look at what's the dialogue afterwards on that. So I think there's different ways to settle into this, or to at least have that conversation. I've had two of our instructors move towards co-construction of this understanding too. First day, they sit down with the syllabus and say, how are we going to value grades in here? How are we going to approach grading in this class? Here's you know, they basically say, here's the framework they come from, and they want to go in this ungrading route, but where are we going to kind of create a contract between each other of what we think is comfortable?
So talk a little bit about contract grading, and maybe Jose can as well, because I think he's done some of that.
It can take a few different forms, but you know, kind of simply put, it's this idea of, you know, you decide with, you know, if I'm a student, I decide I want an A this year. Okay, well, here's the things you need to do to receive an A, and then you agree to go down the A path, and it's an A or not A. This is where you're at. You need to achieve these marks because you've signed up for that contract. Jose, you want to chime in a bit with that on how you've approached it?
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky that I got into a grant with Asao Inoue, who kind of taught us contract grading, and he's one of the, you know, big contract grading guys. So theoretically, I'm 100% on board with the idea of contract grading, which is like you said. So at the beginning, you kind of say, okay, you sign a contract with your students. So an A.
No.
Your A, depending on the labor you put in. And so you write this contract that says A is this much labor, right? You got to do these papers, these discussions, whatever it is. So you sign that contract. And this is why I said it became more work than I felt it was good for, because then you got to reassess those contracts with those students throughout the semester, right? You got to come back and say, okay, you wanted an A, but you know, you missed this part, you missed that part. So now you're in breach of contract. We need to renegotiate. And that, I mean, for me, that just became tedious. And then there was the parts where they met a lot of the contract, but not quite. So then we're back to the logistics of like, okay, so they wanted an A. They did all of the stuff for the contract for an A except for this. So I guess that's a B. And it got more complicated and confusing. And again, it goes back to, so the labor you put in, so maybe the A is, you know, you rewrite your essay, you turn it in, you do the peer review, you revise it, you see instructor, you revise it again. And like some people have already said, some students don't have the time for that, right? But then that is also part of the contract grade, is like you have to, right, the students have to be self-aware to say, I only have time to put in the labor for a B. But as we know, sometimes students really want that A and they're just not putting in the work, and then there's those conversations. So I was never fully satisfied with the contract grading. I haven't figured out a way that I'm satisfied with doing contract grading.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are some of the challenges I think that come up with that, because you are in a way kind of reducing the stress of grades, but you are creating a lot of like gamification of like, well, what is this path and this path?
Right.
And it could be a problematic.
And I would say it's obvious, right? I mean, it's yes, if you have the ability, but the kid with ADHD that takes twice as long to write his paper, the contract grading system kind of starts to break down.
And the more assignments you have, the more complex your contracts are, the more you're going to be doing that grading, you know, components or doing the administrative work. The one thing I like about contract grading, I think more so than anything, like what is, you know, you actually know students will come in and say, I want the C. And, you know, at first, like some instructors will be like, why would a student want a C? But we realize we all come into things wanting certain amounts of things, right? You sometimes want to learn a little bit, sometimes you want to learn a lot, and they're at least being honest with it. They know, hey, that's not my major, or I just need this class, and you know, I have a lot of other classes. They basically are being honest with you and saying, I'm prioritizing these other classes over here. I'm going to do not C-level work. I'm going to do what needs to be done to get to the C, and that's a different component. So I like that idea of it, but as you said, Jose, the logistics are challenging.
I do say, like, I also, right, one of the things Inoue talked about is it is an anti-racist work because we're not grading, it's especially for writing classes, right? I'm not grading the student on proper standardized English. I'm grading them on the labor they put in to their paper. So if their grammar isn't perfect, that's fine. You can still get your A because you've put in the work. So I do like that aspect of it too, where it's that de-emphasis on some idea of a proper standardized English for, you put in the work and you learn something.
And that's one way, as we close a bit, one way that you can do this with ungrading is it's sort of an unsigned contract where at the sort of, somewhere around the midpoint in the course, you meet with each student and kind of give them a sense of where they're at, ask them where they want to be. So that's the, what grade do you think you're at right now? And, you can kind of throw your letters, whatever you want at it. And if they say, well, I want to be an A. Okay, well, let's talk about some goals rather than like a contract. You need to be able to show me this and this by the end of the semester. Right. It actually makes it easier to have that conversation at the end and say, well, you didn't meet those things you said you were going to do. So we're going to, you don't get the A. Or you did meet those, but like they each had their own benchmark, which means meeting them where they're at. If the students achieve what you kind of agree, that's a good benchmark growth point for you. You get the A. That's the A for effort in that case. That's the, that's the work because I can say that you set out what you wanted to achieve and you grew in that direction, and we didn't have to throw numbers at it.
So this is two quick things. This is something in a survey at the beginning of the course is good to establish because I always ask them, what do you think you're going to get in this class? What's your goal? And they'll tell me something and then we can discuss as the whole class. If you want to get the A, this is what you're going to do. It's not necessarily, you can make the contract after you make the syllabus. And so that's kind of interesting. But my dual enrollments have figured out that freshman, sophomore year, as long as it has a T, as long as you get a C and it transfers, because it doesn't necessarily go for your four-year college.
It's just an elective.
It's just an elective or whatever it is, and if you transfer from Brightpoint to Reynolds, it's just gonna be a T anyway, or you're going to a four-year school, and they're going, all I wanna get is a C till it transfers. And so they might do it to themselves, where they don't necessarily wanna go higher. You don't want them to do that, but it is true. You just need a C.
We operate the system.
It's the way we operate, so it's, you gotta scan the system.
Yeah, but sometimes I think grades are magical to some students, like they don't know where they come from. So what you're talking about helps them to understand that there's a correlation between the work you put in.
But ask them in the beginning,
Yeah, and I think that and make sure that when you're asking them, it's not, okay, and then we have a quantitative checklist of things to do to get the, is it more of a deeper understanding if that's what you're looking at in terms of your outcomes? Like, I want you to be able to argue about this, not you need to turn in your paper. It's two different things. And then you can have that, like, yes, it's a bit subjective, but as an instructor, again, we get back to you do know when they know this information. We've probably all been in the situation where we've given someone a grade, given it to them. We're like, they are not an A student. They did not do an A in this class. They did everything on that syllabus that says it's an A. Sometimes it works both ways.
Yeah.
You get the point?
I just need to say, I think on some level, if I'm sitting there at the beginning of the semester and the majority of students are like, I just want to see, I think I might be able to, that might kill me, from the beginning. So I think there's also that piece of thinking about it from that instructor perspective. If you're teaching a class full of students that are just kind of self-admitting, I don't really want to be here. And I will say that happens a lot to science majors. Now, again, it's my job to make them love it. And I will say one of my favorite things is on evaluations at the end of the semester, if they say, I learned more than I thought I would, or this was a lot more fun than I thought it was gonna be, I won, right? But if they're coming in with that attitude at the beginning, that's just very demoralizing as the instructor.
Yeah.
So,
We all want them to love our subjects, right? And never gonna have the passion that you're gonna have.
I know, but man, get right in the gate.
It's still hard. It still hurts,
I don't wanna
yes.
be here. It's just, that's hard.
How could she do rocks among volcanoes, how can they not love that?
I know, yeah.
And paleontology apparently I learned yesterday,
Yeah.
gosh.
No, I teach in this course in the nurse anesthesia program, and it's one of those weird kind of amalgamation courses that has too many things in it. And one of the parts is like education, leadership, and so I teach that section of it. But initially I talked to them about, like, I do an anonymous survey about like what they're interested in. Are they interested in this subject? And you know, there's always about a third of the class, it's like, I'm not interested in this subject, I don't tend to use it. And we talked about that broadly. I'm like, see, I acknowledge this fact that a lot of you in the room don't care what I'm saying. And that's okay. That means I need to understand as I'm talking and communicating to this class, there's two different sets of interests. Now I can usually tell, because you got the sparkle eyes up here, they're like, I want to be an instructor myself and I'm hanging on every word. And you got the ones in the back, just, I'm there because they want to be, you know, in the hospital. This is just a class that is required for them to take. How do you balance it? You know, so you try not to take it personally, because you're just like, okay, well,
Yeah.
but they're gonna be there, yeah.
I like what Jose said there, because I was wondering the answer to that question, like, what if, I said I wanted an A, but then life gets in the way, and maybe now I'm gonna have to take the C. You can negotiate, come back to the table and talk about.
And it's just empowering, it breaks down that dynamic between like, well, the instructor is this, you know, is a certain level, and I can't dare have a conversation with them.
Yes.
Yeah, you can, you're adults, just let's start practicing this right away, like, you know, you can,
Yeah,
doesn't mean you're gonna get your way, because we still have power dynamics and stuff, there's things in that, you know, we all know this, but we need to start allowing people to like have these conversations and you know,
I always, it's,
advocate for themselves.
interesting to me to see that we have students that come to us and they know everything is negotiable. Then we have students that come to us that have never had that opportunity.
Right.
Yeah,
And so to help them to learn how to do that is pretty cool.
and without that, those who know how are gonna continue to kind of separate themselves, and that's not great either. I don't have any final thoughts other than, again, it's a messy subject, but it's just, you know, generally I feel better going down this path than I do down the graded path, so we're gonna continue to push in this direction, but is there any other questions, thoughts?
So what do you do at the end? When you
How do
have
you
to
give a
put something
grade?
in SIS, how do you give it? You have to give them something.
So the way that we've done it is the students submit what they think their grade's gonna be, and the instructor submits theirs, and they do kind of a reconciliation process. There's only been one
Do you have an outside person that's actually judging this, or is it just the instructor and the
just the
student?
instructor and the
Okay.
student. We've only had one situation where the student's grade was higher. Most of the time, the student's grades were lower. They're like, yeah, and you know, so they had that and submitted the grade. You know, in our case, it doesn't go, our campus doesn't push right into our SIS, it's a manual process.
Yeah, we do that.
So they just,
You do.
so they just enter the grade.
Yeah.
And there, you know, there has not been any issue with that. It's, you know, everything is documented in terms of like, we met, we talked, we discussed, you know, so there could be those conversations. But it, you know, I'm not saying those exceptions won't occur, but they're not there to the extent that you might think they would be. Yeah, and I think there is that sense of you know, humbleness, like I can't say that I did great at this. You know?
Yeah.
So you know, you can have the conversation both ways. Anything else?
No, thank you so much, because I'm already like messaging VP and a couple people, like, I should probably do this again. So, no, thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone being here for this. It's an interesting conversation, to say the least.
We have peer conferences for our different, like English, we're having a dual enrollment, I'm having a distance learning one, and having it in February, but would you be interested sometimes coming out and doing it outside of, because you're not a
Yeah.
employee, you know, we can actually pay you for it, but,
Be happy to talk.
but I'm just wondering if you would be spreading this to other schools, because, you know, there are 23 colleges, and
Yeah, no, I would be
do
happy
you
to
find
share
that
the
other
conversation.
colleges are doing this
The ungrading?
nationally?
Yeah, there's pockets of this. It is
Yeah.
growing, but it, you know, a lot of it's growing at the faculty level.
Mhm.
You know, I don't think I've seen anywhere in the research I've done, a college saying like, we're a college that doesn't grade.
Mhm.
But like, there are colleges that are more supportive of it. and kind of giving instructors to say like, you know what, let's have the conversation around this. And ultimately, if it keeps students enrolled, and that's a good thing, you know, and it keeps students wanting to go to the next part, it's a good thing. One of the things that I'm working on this year that maybe I can come back and share too is one thing I've read a bit is the idea that, you know, Canvas, I was gonna say that, you know, Canvas is kind of flies in the face of this because it's very like put in points and score.
Right.
I'm our Canvas administrator for the college and design the templates and everything. So I'm thinking, I'm working on designing a ungraded based template and concept for classes. So I really think that, you know, I think the system can adapt to that. I just don't think it's the default. So, you know, I'm happy to share that once we get that out there. I want to put that out, just open source anyway, but I think there's a way to prepare courses so that they can, you know, utilize this process a little bit more.
Yeah, there's an option in Canvas to use emojis. We don't
There-
have
it's
that
a-
option, but.
There are
You
there are
made me
many
think
tools
about
you can
that.
turn on, so I'm hoping that's one of my research pursuits for the year here is push the buttons in that direction.
Thank you for coming.
Excellent. No, I really appreciate it, and anytime.